The year was 1835, and the high mountain air of the Green River Rendezvous smelled of wood smoke, rotting beaver pelts, and the looming scent of spilled blood. This was not a place for the faint of heart. It was a lawless convergence of the desperate and the daring, where the only justice was found at the end of a blade or the muzzle of a Hawken rifle. Historical records from this era show that these annual gatherings were more than mere trade fairs. They were volatile pressure cookers of ego, alcohol, and the raw, unbridled testosterone of men who lived every day on the razor's edge of extinction. In the heart of this chaos stood a man who seemed to embody the very spirit of mindless brutality, a French-Canadian trapper named Chouinard. He was a mountain of a man, a giant who used his physical displacement to terrorize the smaller, more disciplined men of the camp. To understand this moment, we must look at the forgotten customs of the fur trapping era. In a world without sheriffs, courts, or written laws, a man's reputation, his medicine, as some called it, was his only shield. To allow an insult to pass was to invite a slow death by 1,000 humiliations. Chouinard knew this. He delighted in it. He spent the morning riding his massive horse through the camp, shouting drunken insults, beating those who couldn't defend themselves, and boasting that he could take any American and switch him like a disobedient child. The harsh reality of the 1830s meant that a man's size was often his destiny. But Chouinard had made a fatal miscalculation. He had not yet accounted for Christopher Kit Carson. At this moment in history, Carson was not the legend we know today. He was a diminutive man, barely 5.5 feet tall, often described by contemporaries as modest, quiet, and possessing eyes that seemed to see through the very soul of the wilderness. But beneath that unassuming exterior lay a core of tempered steel. As Chouinard's insults reached a fever pitch, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the rendezvous. The mountain men, hardened veterans who had survived grisly attacks and Blackfoot war parties, watched with bated breath. They saw the giant Chouinard, fueled by whiskey and arrogance, making a mockery of the American trappers. The threshold had been reached. Carson, who had been sitting quietly by a fire, rose. He did not shout. He did not boast. He simply walked toward his horse with a deliberate, haunting calmness that should have served as a warning to the giant. The physical disparity was almost comical. The massive Frenchman atop a powerful stallion looking down at the slight, wiry Missourian. But in Carson's mind, the decision had already been made. This was the moment where the internal struggle between the desire for peace and the necessity of violence collided. Carson knew that if he did not act, the social fabric of the camp would dissolve into further bullying and chaos. He approached Chouinard, and in a voice that carried across the sudden stillness of the valley, challenged the giant's right to insult his countrymen. The giant's response was a sneer of contempt, a laugh that echoed off the granite peaks of the Rockies. He did not see a threat. He saw a small man begging for a lesson in humility. But Kit Carson was not asking for a lesson. He was offering a finality. As Carson mounted his own horse, the air grew cold, despite the summer sun. He gripped a single-shot pistol, a tool of precision in a hand that did not shake. The technical reality of this duel was terrifying. On horseback, with primitive firearms that often misfired, a duel was less about marksmanship and more about the raw courage to hold one's nerve while staring into the eyes of a man trying to kill you. The crucial threshold was crossed the moment Carson's spurs touched his horse's flanks. There would be no retreat. There would be no apology. Only the sudden, violent resolution of a conflict that had been brewing in the lawless heart of the West. Before we dive deeper into the archives of the past, subscribe to Wildbound History and tell us in the comments, what country and city are you watching from? To understand the weight of the confrontation between Kit Carson and the giant Chouinard, We must first open the invisible archive of daily life in the Rocky Mountains during the 1830s. The existence of a mountain man was not defined by constant gunfights, but by a routine of extreme deprivation and a near spiritual connection to the tools of his survival. The harsh reality of the 1830s meant that every object a man carried was a testament to his resilience and his standing in the raw social hierarchy of the frontier. Historical records from this era show that a trapper's life was a constant struggle against physical decay. Their clothing was not made of fine fabrics, but of hand-cured buckskin, often stiffened by animal blood, campfire grease, and the salt of months of sweat without a proper bath. To a modern viewer, the scent of a camp like the Green River Rendezvous would be overpowering, an acrid mix of castoreum, the beaver gland used as bait, willow smoke and buffalo meat drying in the sun. Yet, for Carson, this was the smell of both freedom and imminent danger. In this archive of life, the most sacred tool was the rifle. Most American trappers utilized the Hawken rifle, crafted in St. Louis. It was a heavy weapon with an iron barrel that required sheer physical strength just to hold steady. To understand this moment, we must look at the forgotten customs of black powder firearm handling. A missed shot didn't just mean losing a meal. In a duel like the one unfolding, it meant certain death. The process of loading a muzzleloader was a ritual of patience under pressure. Pouring the exact measure of powder, seating the patch, driving the lead ball down with a wooden ramrod, and placing the percussion cap on the nipple. Carson, despite his slight stature, was a master of this mechanical choreography. While Chouinard relied on brute force and the fear he instilled, Carson relied on the precision of his hands and the impeccable maintenance of his gear. Carson's memoirs, dictated years later, reveal a fascinating contrast between the necessary violence of the era and the soul of a man who valued silence. In the camp, while Chouinard bellowed and displayed his rustic opulence, Carson frequently sought the periphery. The weight of memories from his Missouri childhood, the early loss of his father in a work accident, and his flight from a saddler's apprenticeship he detested, all accumulated on his shoulders. He didn't seek fame. He sought a place where his competence spoke louder than his lineage or his height. The history of the everyday at the rendezvous was also marked by diet. These men lived on boudins, roasted buffalo intestines, and bitter coffee when available. Alcohol, usually low-quality Taos Lightning whiskey brought by trade caravans, functioned as fuel for both courage and madness. It was under the influence of this fuel that Chouinard transformed from a simple bully into an existential threat. He represented everything Carson despised, the tyranny of strength over character. Sitting in his Spanish-style saddle, feeling the cold leather against his legs, Carson must have felt the weight of every decision that led him here. The texture of the reins in his hands, the warmth of the horse's flank, and the metallic click of the hammer being drawn back were the only realities that mattered. Chouinard, with his massive mount, was like a tower of flesh and arrogance, but Carson understood the geometry of survival. He knew that in the mountains, the size of a man was measured by his ability to remain calm when chaos roared. When we look at the artifacts of this period, the Green River knives with bone handles, the carved powder horns, the hand-forged iron traps, we see more than tools of labor. We see the curriculum of a life spent in isolation. For Carson, facing Chouinard was not merely a matter of nationalistic pride between Americans and French Canadians. It was the act of a man protecting his vital space. He knew that if he allowed the giant to trample him, he would lose not only his dignity, but his effectiveness as a leader and scout. The archive of life for Kit Carson was about to gain a chapter written in gunpowder and blood, a page that would permanently separate the common man from the myth about to be born. The resilience of these pioneers did not come from an absence of fear, but from a profound acceptance of mortality. In the everyday life of the frontier, death was a loud neighbor. You saw it in the eyes of a comrade sick with cholera, in the remains of a horse taken by wolves, and in the silence that followed a single shot in the woods. By challenging the giant, Carson was simply inviting that neighbor for a final dance. He was ready for his legacy to be sealed right there in the dust of Green River, as long as it was a legacy of resistance rather than submission. The dust of the Green River Rendezvous hung in the air like a shroud, but for Kit Carson, the true weight was not in the atmosphere. It was in the crushing silence of his own mind. To understand the duel that was about to unfold, one must first analyze the psychological isolation that defined the life of a mountain man in the 1830s. Historical records from this era show that these men spent upwards of 11 months a year in near total solitude, or in the company of only a few weathered souls, surrounded by a wilderness that was as indifferent to their survival as the stars above. This geographical isolation did more than toughen the skin, it rewired the psyche. The harsh reality of the 1830s meant that a man's internal world became his only sanctuary. For Carson, a man of few words and even fewer boasts, this isolation had forged a personality of extreme internal discipline. In the wild, there is no audience for one's grievances. There is no court to settle a dispute over a trapline or a stolen horse. When a man is alone against the elements, he learns that his only true ally is his own resolve. This creates a specific type of frontier psychology, a warrior's stoicism, where every perceived insult is not just a social slight, but a direct threat to the internal order that keeps a man sane in the wilderness. To understand this moment, we must look at the forgotten customs of the mountain man's social code. In the high desert and the deep timber, reputation was the only currency that didn't devalue. If a man was perceived as weak, he was not just bullied, he was systematically erased from the collective respect of the camp. The psychological isolation Carson felt in that moment was the realization that if he did not act, he would be forever alone, even in a crowd of his peers. He would be the man who stayed silent while a giant mocked his heritage. The pressure of being alone against the world was not a metaphor for Carson, it was the literal state of his existence. Imagine the mental landscape of a man who has spent years tracking beaver through freezing streams, sleeping with one eye open for fear of Blackfoot raiding parties, and speaking more to his horse than to any human being. This isolation breeds a hyper-awareness of one's surroundings. As Carson sat atop his horse, the sounds of the rendezvous, the distant barking of dogs, the drunken laughter from the French-Canadian tents, the crackle of 100 fires faded into a dull hum. His focus narrowed until the only thing that existed in the entire universe was Chouinard. This is the predatory focus that isolation grants. While the giant was distracted by his own ego and the cheers of his sycophants, Carson was mentally dismantling the man in front of him. Historical analysis suggests that the isolation of the frontier often led to mountain fever, a state of irritability and hair-trigger violence born from the stress of constant vigilance. But Carson was different. His isolation had granted him a chilling clarity. He wasn't acting out of a drunken rage, he was performing a social surgery. He understood that the only way to bridge the gap between his modest stature and the giant's physical dominance was through an act of such cold, calculated bravery that it would resonate through the mountains for decades. The psychological impact of geographical isolation also meant that these men had a different relationship with death. To a pioneer, the grave was always just a footfall away. This familiarity with the end of all things stripped away the hesitation that plagues more civilized men. As Carson looked at Chouinard, he wasn't thinking about the life he might lose. He was thinking about the dignity he had to maintain. The silence of the mountains had taught him that a long life of cowed submission was far more terrifying than a quick death on the field of honor. In those final seconds before the charge, the isolation reached its peak. The hundreds of onlookers might as well have been ghosts. It was just two men, two horses, and the raw, unpainted truth of the American West. Carson felt the physical weight of his pistol, the rough texture of the wooden grip, and the heat of the sun on his neck. His mind was a vacuum devoid of doubt. He had survived the silence of the Great Plains and the screaming winds of the Rockies. He would not be broken by the noise of a bully. This was the psychological triumph of the quiet man. The moment where the inner strength gathered in years of solitude outweighed the blustering mass of 1,000 giants. The tension at the Green River Rendezvous had reached a point of no return. The air, thick with the scent of pine and the metallic tang of unsheathed steel, seemed to vibrate with the collective heartbeat of the mountain men. This was the breaking point, the climax of a confrontation that would define the moral geography of the frontier. Historical records from this era show that when Kit Carson finally spurred his horse forward, he wasn't just defending his own honor, he was challenging the very concept of might makes right in a land that knew no other law. The two men sat on their horses, separated by only a few yards of churned earth. Chouinard, the Gallic giant, sat tall and mocking, his large-bore rifle resting across his saddle. He looked at the slight, 5'4" Carson with a mixture of amusement and contempt. To understand this moment, we must look at the forgotten customs of the mounted duel. It was a chaotic, high-stakes gamble, where the movement of the animal was as critical as the aim of the man. The harsh reality of the 1830s meant that a single-shot pistol was a fickle ally. If it flashed in the pan or the ball strayed, the reloading process was impossible before a second, lethal blow could be struck. Carson didn't wait for a signal. He didn't wait for the giant to finish his last boast. With a sudden, explosive burst of motion, he kicked his horse into a gallop directly at Chouinard. The spectators gasped, a collective intake of breath that signaled the gravity of the event. The ground shook under the hooves of the charging animals. Chouinard, startled by the sheer audacity of the smaller man's aggression, scrambled to bring his rifle to bear. This was the breaking point, where the physical world narrowed down to the sight bead of a weapon and the glint in an opponent's eye. As the horses drew level, the distance between the two combatants vanished. It was a cinematic collision of trajectories. Chouinard fired first. The roar of his rifle shattered the mountain silence, a plume of acrid white smoke momentarily obscuring the giant. The ball whistled past Carson's head, so close he could feel the displacement of air. It grazed his scalp, shearing off a lock of hair, but leaving the man untouched. In that split second, Carson's own arm rose. He didn't aim with his eyes. He aimed with the instinct born of years of survival. His pistol spoke a fraction of a second after the Frenchman's. The crack of the smaller weapon was sharp, like a whip snap in the valley. The ball caught Chouinard in the hand, shattering the bones of his thumb and traveling upward into his forearm. The giant's rifle clattered to the ground, his dominance broken in a single, violent heartbeat. The aftermath of the shots was a deafening silence. Chouinard let out a guttural cry of pain, his massive frame slumped over the pommel of his saddle. He was no longer a predator. He was a wounded animal, stripped of the arrogance that had sustained his tyranny. Carson, however, did not celebrate. He did not shout in triumph. He pulled his horse to a halt, his face a mask of grim professional detachment. He had done what was necessary. He had met the breaking point with a level of cold-blooded composure that terrified the onlookers more than any shout could have. This act of bravery was raw and powerful, narrated with the gravity of an event that defines an era. It wasn't just a win in a fight. It was the birth of a legend. The trappers watched as Carson calmly turned his horse back toward the American camp. The hierarchy of the mountains had been permanently recalibrated. To understand this moment, we must realize that Carson had used the giant's own momentum against him, both physically and psychologically. He had shown that in the American West, the medicine of a quiet man who is willing to die is far more potent than the bluster of a loud man who only wishes to live. The physical toll was immediate. The smell of burnt powder, the sight of Chouinard's blood staining the dry grass, and the trembling of the horses as they cooled down. But the historical toll was even greater. This duel signaled that the era of the lawless bully was ending and the era of the disciplined scout was beginning. Kit Carson had crossed the Rubicon of his own life. He entered the fray as a mere trapper. He emerged as the man who would eventually guide Fremont and help shape the borders of a continent. The breaking point was the crucible where the iron of his character was finally hammered into steel. The smoke from the black powder hung low over the Green River Valley, a drifting ghost of the violence that had just transpired. In the silence that followed the twin cracks of the firearms, the historical aftermath began to take shape, not in books, but in the shifting eyes of the hundreds of men who had witnessed the fall of a titan. Historical records from this era show that this duel was a cultural pivot point. It wasn't just a fight between two men, it was a collision between the old world of the lawless, brute force voyageur and the emerging American archetype of the cool-headed, disciplined frontiersman. The harsh reality of the 1830s meant that medical care was almost non-existent in the wilderness. As Chouinard was helped from his horse, clutching a hand shattered by Carson's lead ball, he faced a grim future. In the mountains, an injury to the hands was often a death sentence for a trapper. Without the dexterity to set a beaver trap or the strength to handle a rifle, a man became a liability to his brigade. To understand this moment, we must look at the forgotten customs of frontier mercy. Carson did not follow up his shot. He did not seek to execute the giant as he lay broken. This restraint was perhaps his most powerful statement. He had proven his point. The era of Chouinard's tyranny was over, silenced by a man half his size. The historical aftermath ripples through the journals of those present, such as the missionary Samuel Parker, who noted the event with a mixture of horror and fascination. For the American trappers, Carson became an overnight symbol of resilience. He had stepped forward when others had looked at the ground. This event recalibrated the social hierarchy of the fur trade. No longer was the small man from Missouri just another hand in the mountains. He was now a man whose medicine was respected by both white trappers and the Native American tribes, the Shoshone, Nez Perce, and Flatheads, who frequented the rendezvous. But what of the psychological aftermath? For Carson, this was the acceptance of a destiny he had not necessarily sought. He had learned that in the great tapestry of history, some men are destined to be the thread that holds the fabric together through sheer force of will. The adrenaline faded, replaced by the bone-deep exhaustion that follows a brush with death. This was the history of the emotional toll. Carson returned to his camp, cleaned his pistol, and resumed his duties. There were no parades, no medals, only the quiet realization that his life would never be the same. He had entered the archive of legends. Technically, this duel solidified the American presence in the disputed Oregon Territory. It showed the British and French-Canadian interests that the American mountain men were not just rugged individuals, but a force of nature that would not be intimidated. The geographical reality of the West was being mapped not just by transit and sextant, but by the reputations of the men who walked it. Carson's victory was a micro-event that signaled a macro shift. The westward expansion was moving from a disorganized scramble for furs into a structured, albeit violent, push for continental dominance. As the 1835 rendezvous broke up and the brigades headed back into the high timber for the fall hunt, the story of the giant and the trapper traveled with them. It was told around fires from the Gila River to the Columbia. In the historical aftermath, Chouinard faded into the footnotes of time, a cautionary tale of arrogance. Meanwhile, Kit Carson began the long climb toward becoming the most famous scout in American history. He had looked into the abyss of the frontier's lawlessness and, instead of blinking, he had fired back. As the years bled into decades, the dust of the Green River Rendezvous settled, but the echo of Kit Carson's shot never truly vanished. We now enter the final chamber of our journey, the legacy and final reflection. To look back at Carson's stand against Chouinard is to look into a mirror of the American spirit, a complex, often violent, but undeniably resilient image of what it means to stand one's ground against overwhelming odds. Historical records from the mid-19th century show that Carson himself rarely spoke of the duel in his later years. To him, it wasn't a moment of cinematic glory. It was a burdensome necessity of a bygone era. This humbleness is the hallmark of the true frontier survivor. The harsh reality of the 1830s eventually gave way to the wagon trains of the 1850s and the iron rails of the 1860s, but the foundational myth of the quiet man of honor remained. Carson transitioned from a trapper to a guide for John C. Fremont, and eventually to a brigadier general. Yet he always carried the lessons of that afternoon in 1835. That power without character is merely a shadow, and that the smallest man can cast the longest shadow if he stands in the light of truth. To understand this legacy, we must look at the forgotten customs of how we remember our heroes. Today, we often view the past through a lens of black and white, but Carson's life was lived in the vibrant, bloody grays of a world being born. His resilience was not just physical. It was the psychological endurance to navigate a changing world while maintaining a personal code of conduct. The duel with Chouinard was the original sin of his fame, the moment the public began to project their desires for a frontier savior onto a man who just wanted to be left alone with the mountains. This story serves as a profound documentary tribute to human resilience. It teaches us that while the tools of our survival have changed, from Hawken rifles to digital archives, the core of the human struggle remains the same. We all face our giants. We all face moments where the psychological isolation of our challenges feels insurmountable. Carson's legacy is a reminder that the silence of the wilderness does not have to break us. It can forge us. As we reflect on this historical journey, we see that Kit Carson was more than just a scout. He was a bridge between the wild unknown and the civilization that followed. He was a man who understood the weight of his decisions and the gravity of his actions. When the dust finally settled on his life in 1868, his last words were reportedly, "Goodbye, friends. Adios, compadres." It was a fitting end for a man who had spent his life navigating the boundaries between cultures, between sizes, and between life and death. The story of the small trapper and the giant bully is a permanent thread in the great tapestry of history. It is a story of how the West was not just won by armies, but by individuals who refused to be stepped on. It is a testament to the fact that honor is not a gift, but something earned in the dirt, under the sun, at the end of a long and lonely road. Thank you for exploring the untamed past with us at Wildbound History. If you believe these stories of resilience must never be forgotten, hit the like button and subscribe for our next historical journey. Until next time, stay wild.